They said it happened at 9:14 p.m. But the truth is, the moment detonated long before anyone checked a clock. The room was too quiet for a night like this. Midterms. A divided nation. Reporters pacing like caged animals. Screens humming. Advisors whispering in that way Washington whispers when it already knows it's losing control. And then. The audio feed cracked. Just one glitch. Sharp. Metallic. Wrong. Most people ignored it. Most people always do. But a few heads turned. A few people felt something cold move through the air. You know that feeling. The one you get right before a storm hits but the wind hasn't caught up yet. That was the feeling in the West Wing hallway when the door opened. And Marcus Trenton stepped into the light. His tie was loosened. His jaw was set. His eyes, usually restless, were frighteningly still. "Is the room ready?" he asked. No emotion. No hesitation. Just a man walking toward a moment even his closest advisors weren't prepared for. They didn't know it yet. Washington didn't know it yet. But this was the night everything fractured. The celebration had already soured. And no one could explain why. But the real story hadn't even started. Someone whispered, "Sir, we can wait for projections." He didn't answer. He just kept walking. Measured steps, almost too slow for who he used to be. Because Marcus Trenton wasn't a man who slowed down. He was the outsider who rejected Washington rituals. The disruptor who didn't care about the old rules. The kid from a forgotten steel town who promised to shake the foundations of the Capitol. But tonight, something was off. A pressure. A weight behind his eyes. A warning no one else could hear. You've seen this before. That moment right before a person breaks the script they've lived by for years. He reached the briefing podium. Placed both hands on it. A simple action. But in that stillness, every analyst watching the live feed felt a shift they couldn't explain. Something in him was changing. And the country felt it. A communications tech rushed forward. "Mr. President, sir, we don't have all networks locked in. If you wait 30 seconds. Trenton lifted a hand. Just one finger raised. Not aggressive. Not impatient. Just, final. A gesture that said. No more waiting. Cameras reoriented. Red tally lights blinked alive. The hum in the room changed pitch. You know that hum, the one that tells you the entire nation is now watching. Except Trenton wasn't looking at the cameras. He was staring past them. Past the reporters. Past Washington. Almost like he was staring at someone he knew would be listening. He took one breath. Slow. Controlled. And then, without warning, he said the words that would send the Capitol into chaos. But not yet. Because right before he spoke, the lights flickered. Just once. A subtle dip in power. A second of darkness. A single heartbeat where the entire West Wing felt like a trapdoor had opened under their feet. And then. The lights snapped back. Most dismissed it as a glitch. But the cracks spread quietly. Tonight, Trenton said. His voice steady, low, unmistakably certain. The American people made their choice. A normal opening. A predictable line. Except everyone in the room felt the undertone. A soft rumble beneath the words. Not triumph. Not concession. Something else. Something heavier. You know this feeling. The moment when someone speaks with a truth they've carried too long. Trenton continued. And because of that choice. I'm making mine. Advisors stiffened. Someone dropped a pen. One of the reporters mouthed, "What is happening?" Because that line. That sentence. Was not on any speech draft. Not on any teleprompter. Not approved by any staff. This was Trenton breaking script. And everyone felt the air change. While the country heard the words. While networks scrambled for context. While analysts began typing emergency notes. One small detail slid past unnoticed. Trenton wasn't reading. His teleprompter was blank. No text. No guidance. No script. He came here with nothing but whatever was burning through him. And that's what made the moment dangerous. Because when leaders go off script, history rewrites itself in real time. But the real danger wasn't change. It was who controlled the definition of normal. Trenton exhaled, as if steadying himself. I didn't come here tonight to talk about victory or defeat, he said. I came here to talk about truth. A murmur spread. Reporters leaned forward. Phones were raised. And here's the part almost no one saw coming. He paused. Held it. Let the silence stretch until it felt like the country itself was holding its breath. Then. For the last 18 months, I have been carrying information. That changes everything about how our government has been operating. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered, he's not doing this. He can't be doing this. But he was. And he wasn't slowing down. Tonight, he said, I am releasing that information. A sentence too sharp. Too clean. Too irreversible. A sentence that would blow a hole straight through Washington's sense of reality. Screens lit up. Newsrooms erupted. Messages flew across encrypted channels. This wasn't expected. This wasn't coordinated. This was a bombshell. And Marcus Trenton was lighting the fuse on live television. But then. Just as he was about to reveal the heart of his message. A sound broke through the room. A soft click. Barely audible. Like a door latch easing open somewhere behind the cameras. Trenton heard it. He turned his head slightly. Just enough to suggest that someone, or something, had moved where nothing should be moving. You felt that, didn't you? That instinctive chill when the script of reality bends for half a second. He straightened. Looked back at the camera. Eyes now sharper, darker. And he said. There's something you need to understand first. Another pause. A longer one. Almost like he wanted to make sure someone specific was listening. And after tonight, nothing about Washington will ever be the same. The reporters froze. Staff froze. Millions of viewers froze. Because the President of the United States, even a fictional one, doesn't talk like that unless something enormous is about to break. But what he said next, what he was about to say, never came. Not yet. Because something else happened first. Something no one could explain. Something that split the night in two. But the real story hadn't even started. The moment froze at 9:16 p.m. Later, analysts would argue about what exactly happened in the West Wing that night. Some claimed it was a technical failure. Others insisted it was intentional. But before the chaos, before the headlines, before the fractures in Washington became visible to the naked eye, there was a boy in a town most Americans have never heard of. A steel town. A tired town. A place where the factories coughed out fire at night and silence in the morning. That is where Marcus Trenton learned his first truth. People break before systems do. He was 12 the night the mill shut down. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't a fire. It was something quieter. Something worse. A whistle that never blew again. Men stood outside the gates with thermoses and lunch pails, staring at a padlock that hadn't been there the day before. Trenton watched from across the street. His father didn't speak. Didn't shout. Didn't even look angry. He just stared at the empty mill like a ghost walking past his own grave. You've seen this before. You know that look. The look of a man who realizes life won't be what he promised his family. Marcus never forgot it. Not the silence. Not the stillness. Not the way grown men avoided each other's eyes. That was the night he learned something comfortless and permanent. Normal could vanish without warning. It was the beginning of a scar he carried even when he rose to the highest office in the country. A scar no speechwriters could polish. Something in him was shifting. Even back then, he didn't know what was coming. After the shutdown, his father took him to the only place still open past midnight. Murphy's Diner. Chrome stools. Fluorescent lights. Coffee that tasted like burnt hope. An American anchor. Marcus remembered the smell. Thick. Warm. Familiar. His father, eyes still hollow, stirred his coffee 3 times, then said, "Don't let anyone tell you how the world works, son. Learn it yourself. And when you learn it, don't forget." A simple sentence. But it lodged in Marcus's brain like a seed waiting for the right storm. This was years before he became the country's most unpredictable outsider. Years before he made decisions that turned Washington into a pressure chamber. But the diner truth stayed with him. Everyone trusts the story they're told. Until they see the part that was hidden. And Marcus Trenton always looked for the hidden part. Always. There was another thing about him. A contradiction, a flaw, a window into his mind. He watched late-night TV religiously. Not the jokes. Not the monologues. Not the celebrity interviews. He watched the commercials. The infomercials. The political ads. The donation please. The charity spots with soft piano music and dimly lit living rooms. "It's amazing how people can be nudged," he once said. Not convinced. Not persuaded. Nudged. Even as a teenager, he studied them like puzzles. Why did some make you feel guilty? Why did some make you feel angry? Why did some feel like someone had slipped into your living room to whisper something you didn't want to hear? Most kids don't think that way. Marcus Trenton did. Imperfection shaped him. Contradiction sharpened him. He believed he could see the mechanics behind emotion. The gears behind belief. The architecture of persuasion. And he believed those who controlled the story, controlled the country. By the time he entered politics, his worldview was already set. Systems lied. People suffered the consequences. And institutions didn't collapse, they quietly shifted shape until no one recognized them anymore. He said once, long before he ran for office. "You don't fix a cracked foundation by repainting the walls. You tear the house down and rebuild it." That made sense in a steel town. It made less sense when he applied it to Washington. But that philosophy led him to the presidency. And that philosophy was also the reason he stood behind a podium on midterm night. Ready to do something no American leader had done before. Because Marcus Trenton genuinely believed the country needed to be shaken awake. But he never expected the storm that would follow. And neither did anyone around him. When he arrived in the Capitol for the first time, he said something odd to an aide. "These buildings feel too clean." The aide laughed it off. But Marcus wasn't joking. He didn't trust polished halls. Didn't trust glass offices. Didn't trust places where powerful people could hide behind procedure. He trusted noise. He trusted friction. He trusted the raw truth of steel and sweat and factories that burned at 4 a.m. Washington felt like a place built on stories instead of substance. And that terrified him more than any opposition party ever could. You know this feeling. The moment when something looks real but feels hollow. Trenton felt that every day he walked through the Capitol. He had a fear, though he denied it. Not of failure. Not of enemies. Not of losing power. Marcus Trenton feared becoming the kind of leader he despised growing up. Steeped in scripts. Polished by committees. Shaped by consultants. Disconnected from the people who lived with consequences. He feared becoming a symbol instead of a man. And that fear drove him to make decisions that, at times, defied logic. Including the decision that led to midterm night. The decision to go off script. The decision to reveal something he believed the country needed to hear. Even if it shattered him. Every documentary analyst pointed this out. Marcus Trenton was a paradox. A man who distrusted systems. Yet became the head of one. A man who believed truth was buried. Yet built his career on spectacle. A man who loved clarity. Yet often operated in chaos. You've seen this type of character before. But not like this. Not on this scale. And certainly not in a moment where the world was watching him unravel his own political future. Something in him was shifting. But he didn't know what was coming. Not yet. To understand the shockwave he unleashed on midterm night. You have to understand the trigger. It wasn't the polls. It wasn't the pressure. It wasn't even the political stakes. It was a discovery. A file. A set of documents brought to him 18 months earlier. Documents that changed what he believed about the country he led. Documents that made him question what power meant. And who truly held it. That discovery drove every decision he made. Every risk he took. Every moment of that night. And those documents. Well, the country wouldn't learn about them for weeks. But the first hint came at 9:17 p.m. When the lights flickered again. And Marcus Trenton glanced, not at the cameras. But toward the far right corner of the room. As if expecting someone. Or fearing someone. No one else noticed. But Trenton did. And that detail would linger long after reporters rewound the footage. Back in the briefing room. As the network scrambled to decipher his unscripted address. Marcus leaned forward like a man ready to tear the facade off the world. And he whispered a line that wasn't meant for the cameras. "You're not going to stop this." He said it quietly. Softly. But with a certainty that didn't match the chaos around him. Who was he speaking to? A person? A group? A system? No one knew. But one thing was clear. The boy from the steel town. Scarred by silence. Shaped by loss. Trained by late-night screens and broken stories. Was about to ignite something Washington wasn't built to handle. And when the fuse burned out, the explosion would echo far beyond politics. Because this wasn't about elections. It was about identity. It was about truth. It was about what happens when a man who never trusted the system finally decides to expose it. And maybe, just maybe, this is where everything begins again. The second flicker of the lights wasn't enough to stop the broadcast. But it was enough to stop Marcus Trenton. For a fraction of a second. He froze. Not the kind of freeze that comes from fear. The kind that comes from recognition. As if the darkness had whispered a reminder meant only for him. You know that feeling. The one where your stomach tightens before your mind catches up. That was the feeling spreading through the West Wing. And then. Marcus steadied himself, exhaled, and continued. At first, he said. The reports looked normal. A strange choice of words. No one knew what reports he meant. Not yet. Then a single detail fractured everything. A reporter flinched. Another lowered her phone as if she suddenly felt exposed. That's how it started. With a single sentence that didn't match any known agenda. Any party line. Any sanctioned talking point. A sentence that felt like an accusation without a target. A rule shift. A breach of the script. Washington thrives on anticipation. On polished expectation. On the predictability of power. But tonight. Nothing was predictable anymore. Someone coughed. Someone else stepped back, bumping into a lighting rig. Trenton continued. Voice tightening like a wire under strain. 18 months ago, he said. My team received intelligence that, at first glance, seemed unrelated. Irrelevant. Harmless. He paused. Not for effect. For calculation. Because he knew what he was about to say would not be reversible. Data inconsistencies. Unexplained reroutes. Numbers that didn't match publicly available records. Reporters glanced at one another. This wasn't policy. This wasn't politics. This was something else. Something systemic. Someone whispered. What is he implying? But Marcus wasn't implying. He was laying a trap. For a truth the country wasn't ready to confront. A producer in the control room later said. I knew the minute he looked down. He wasn't talking to us anymore. He wasn't. His eyes dropped as if he were replaying something vivid and unwelcome. An image burned into memory. And in that moment, the cameras captured something rare. A president fighting his own hesitation. This wasn't supposed to be public, Marcus said quietly. The information I'm about to share. It was meant for a select group. A group that believed the American people weren't ready for the truth. There it was. The first spark of the powder trail. A moral pressure. A contradiction. A threat to the equilibrium that Washington relies on. You've seen this dynamic before. Someone lifting a curtain no one asked to be lifted. But here. On midterm night. With the whole nation watching. That curtain wasn't just being lifted. It was about to be ripped down. A phone vibrated. Then another. Then a dozen more. Advisors stepped out of frame. One by one. Answering calls in hushed, panicked voices. Someone said, shut it down. Someone else said, we can't shut it down. A third voice said, does he understand what he's doing? Marcus didn't react. He kept his hands on the podium. Gripping it. Knuckles whitening. As if anchoring himself to something only he could feel slipping. What you're about to hear, he said, will upset a great many people. Upset was the understatement of the century. A Secret Service agent moved closer. Not a normal step. A defensive step. Protocols were shifting. Something unseen was happening at the edges of the room. Security does not move like that unless something changes. Trenton noticed. He glanced sideways. Just long enough for the camera to catch it. Just long enough for viewers to sense the unease. And then he said. I need to make this absolutely clear. No law was broken. No foreign adversary is involved. This is internal. Internal. A word more explosive than any accusation. A word that reshapes suspicion. A word Washington fears more than scandal. Because internal means structural. Internal means systemic. Internal means the danger is coming from inside the mechanisms that are supposed to keep the country stable. And here's the part almost no one noticed on the first watch. When he said, internal, the Secret Service agent tapped the side of his earpiece. Twice. Twice never means, all good. Twice means, change of plan. Reporters started talking over one another. What agency? Is this about budgets? Is this a national emergency? Mr. President, who approved this disclosure? But Marcus held up his hand again. The same gesture from earlier. The gesture that meant no more waiting. No agency, he said. No department. No office. Not in the way you're thinking. A riddle. A contradiction. A barricade disguised as an answer. The perfect rhetorical valve to increase pressure. Without giving release. And then came the line that dropped the room into near silence. The truth is this. For nearly 2 years, our government has been operating with information that was curated. Not collected. Curated. The word hit like a blade. Not forged data. Not hacked data. Curated. Meaning someone, or something, had been selecting what national decision-makers were allowed to see. Not altering reality. Filtering it. And that was more dangerous. You felt that, didn't you? That slow-rolling dread when you realize the threat isn't chaos. It's intentional design. And then, just as he was about to continue, the screens behind him flickered. This time not a blackout. A single line of white text appeared. So fast most viewers didn't register it. But some did. Enough to start conspiracy threads that night. The text read, "Stand by, priority channel active." Then it vanished. Trenton turned around. A subtle look. A worried one. This wasn't part of his reveal. This wasn't part of anything planned. America didn't know it yet. But that text would become the most analyzed 5 words in modern investigative journalism. Because no one knew which system sent it. Not the networks. Not the White House. Not the cybersecurity teams. It just appeared. And disappeared. Like an intrusion. Like a warning. Like a reminder. When Marcus turned back to the microphone, his tone changed. Barely. But unmistakably. A tremor. The smallest fracture. Not fear. Recognition. As I said, he continued. The reports were curated. His voice wasn't just narrating anymore. It was remembering. And the reason this matters is because he stopped. A full 2 seconds. On live television. With the world watching. 2 seconds is an eternity when the truth hangs in the air. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter. More personal. There was one detail everyone missed. You heard that line before. But this time, it wasn't a narrative device. It was confession. Marcus leaned closer. The camera caught every scar of exhaustion on his face. The danger wasn't what they hid, he said. It was what they allowed us to see. A sting. A paradox. A redefinition of threat. Because curated truth isn't false. It's incomplete. And incomplete truth is the most powerful form of control. Especially in a country built on the illusion that information is always free. Mr. President, a reporter pressed. Who curated the data? All eyes turned to Marcus. He didn't answer. Instead, he said something no one expected. Something that didn't fit the rhythm of a political broadcast. Something that felt like a warning whispered across generations. You've asked this question too, he said. Not to the reporter. To the viewers. To the country. To anyone who had ever felt something was off. Without having proof. And then. Without ceremony. Without build-up. Without preamble. He delivered the line that sent Washington into a free fall. The person responsible is someone inside this building. A cold silence. A collective breath held too long. And then the room erupted. Reporters shouting. Lights flaring. Security tightening. Networks scrambling. But Marcus remained still. Perfectly still. Like a man who had just crossed a point no one could walk back from. The White House is usually a machine. A quiet, humming, relentless machine. Even at night, even on weekends, even during war, even during scandal, it moves. Lights buzz. Interns sprint. Printers spit out schedules. Policy advisors whisper in hallways. There is always motion. There is always noise. There is always someone preparing for something. But on the morning after Marcus Trenton's televised shock, for the first time in living memory, the machine stopped. Not metaphorically. Not emotionally. Literally. You could walk through the West Wing and hear nothing but the air vents, and even those sounded like they were whispering. Something had shifted overnight. Something colder. Heavier. More dangerous. Something no one could articulate, but everyone could feel. A presidency that already broke every rule was now about to break something else. The illusion of control. Reporters gathered at the North Lawn press area expecting the usual shouting, the usual jockeying, the usual, who's got the scoop. But nobody argued. Nobody joked. Nobody raised their voice. One journalist whispered. Did anyone else feel like that speech was, not just an announcement, but a threat? Another muttered back. He didn't just say he might run. He said he might return. That's a different energy. Trenton had said nothing explicit. He didn't need to. It was the way he said it. Cinematic. Measured. Almost rehearsed. Almost prophetic. He spoke like a man who already knew the ending, and was daring America to catch up. When the chief of staff entered the Oval, he found the president sitting alone, no papers on the desk, no aides nearby, just staring at a single photograph on the wall. It wasn't a portrait. It wasn't a map. It wasn't a policy memo or a battle plan. It was the famous image of the Founding Fathers in Philadelphia, the signing of the Constitution. The president didn't turn. He didn't blink. He just spoke softly. Marcus Trenton knows the system better than the system knows itself. A line that hung in the air like a storm cloud. The chief of staff cleared his throat. Sir, we have 3 possible scenarios if he moves forward. None of them are good. The president finally turned. 3, he asked. There are 20. And they all end the same way. He didn't elaborate. The chief didn't ask. Downstairs in the Situation Room, a meeting convened that wasn't on the public schedule. It wasn't about Russia. Not China. Not the economy. Not cybersecurity. It was about Trenton. They analyzed his last 48 hours of movements. The people he met. The people he didn't meet. The calls he made. The messages sent through back channels. They mapped it all, and the map didn't make sense. He wasn't acting like a candidate. He wasn't acting like a retiree. He wasn't acting like a commentator. He was acting like something else. Something far more calculated. Far more structured. Far more prepared. One intel officer tapped the table twice and said the words no one wanted recorded in a transcript. Marcus Trenton is moving like a man who already has the numbers. Another replied. Or the leverage. Another corrected. Or both. Leaks always happen in Washington, but this one didn't leak after the meeting. It leaked during it. Before officials even left the Situation Room, a message hit encrypted journalist channels. Senior officials believed Trenton's announcement was not spontaneous, it was coordinated. The White House communications team scrambled to deny it. But the press didn't buy it. Washington didn't buy it. The markets definitely didn't buy it. Something enormous was happening, and everyone knew it. The kind of enormous that doesn't just shift poles. It shifts eras. In a quiet wing of the building, a junior aide wiped her eyes with her sleeve, hoping no one would notice. She wasn't crying because of fear. Or panic. Or chaos. She was crying because she felt something else entirely. History approaching. The kind of history that textbooks oversimplify and documentaries dramatize. But the people living inside it rarely understand. Until it's too late. She whispered to herself. He's coming back. I don't know how. I don't know when. But I can feel it. And she wasn't the only one. From aides to advisors to analysts, everyone felt the same thing. A pressure in the air. A tension in the walls. A vibration in the ground. A return that wasn't official yet. But already real. Meanwhile, miles away, unseen by cameras, Marcus Trenton stepped into a quiet room inside a private residence. He placed his phone face down on the table. Closed the blinds. Sat in a chair like a man preparing for war. Then he said only 4 words. They reacted exactly right. To whom? We still don't know. The documentary will reveal it later. But this much was clear. The chaos was not a byproduct. It was the plan. And he had just confirmed the plan was working. Because the next question wasn't whether Marcus Trenton was returning. The real question was, who was helping him, and why were they already inside the government? Power in Washington doesn't move with press conferences. It doesn't move with speeches. It doesn't move with headlines. Power moves in silence. In whispers. In rooms without windows. On phones that don't save call logs. Through people whose names never appear in newspapers. And on the morning after Marcus Trenton detonated his announcement across the country, those silent channels lit up like a switchboard from the 1940s. No one knew exactly who started making the calls first. But everyone knew who the calls were about. Trenton. The man who wasn't supposed to be part of the story anymore. The man Washington classified as politically dormant. The man thought to be retired, exhausted, irrelevant. And yet, in less than 12 hours, he had become the gravitational center of the entire system again. But this time, something was different. This time, he wasn't the one doing the chasing. He was being chased. By people who were not supposed to be on his side. By people who, in theory, had everything to lose. At 8:14 a.m., a senior senator from a state you could easily find on a map but never imagine in a political thriller, dialed a number that wasn't saved as a contact. It rang twice. A voice answered, low, controlled, analytical. Line secure. Confirmed. There was a pause. Then the senator whispered. If Marcus Trenton is really moving, I want to know before the rest of the chamber does. Tell him I'm open to a conversation. The voice on the other end didn't respond at first. Then, calmly. He already knows you're open. The senator froze. How? The voice replied. Because last night, you didn't deny him. And in Washington, silence is a language. The call ended without another word. The senator stared at the phone, realizing something chilling. Someone was watching the chess board from above. And it wasn't him. An hour later, a private jet touched down at Teterboro under a false flight plan. The passenger on board, an influential billionaire known publicly for neutrality, philanthropy, and clean technology investments. But the moment the cabin door opened, the truth surfaced. He wasn't there for a charity event. He wasn't there for a conference. He wasn't there for business. He was there to get answers. Inside the black SUV that picked him up, he spoke into the shadows of the rear seat. I need to know if Trenton's speech was theater, or a warning. A voice, young, sharp, confident, responded from the dark. It wasn't theater. So it's real? The billionaire asked. It's real enough that you flew here. A long silence. Then. If he returns. I want to be on the ground floor. You already are, the young voice replied. We've been expecting you. But it was the third call, the one made at 11:06 a.m., that mattered most. Because this call didn't come from a senator. Or a billionaire. Or a strategist. Or a donor. This call came from inside a federal agency that had no business getting involved in politics at all. A high-ranking official, whose identity we will not reveal until segment 17, used a classified line normally reserved for emergencies. The voice on the other end answered instantly. "Go ahead." The official didn't hesitate. "Your message was received. If he steps forward, we're not standing in his way." There was no question. No clarification. No negotiation. Just one sentence from the listener. "Good. That means phase 2 can proceed." And then the line disconnected. No trace. No record. No evidence the call ever happened. Except for what came next. By noon, cyber-intelligence analysts tracking the communications surge noticed something unusual. The calls were not random. Not chaotic. Not reactionary. They were coordinated. Different names, different industries, different agendas. But every call pointing toward the same locus of gravity. Trenton. It was as if an invisible network, one dormant for years, suddenly reactivated. Analysts mapped the nodes. 6 cities. 3 industries. 2 federal agencies. And 1 individual at the center. Marcus Trenton, the man the system dismissed. Was behaving like a man who had quietly built an infrastructure big enough to shake the entire country. Inside the West Wing, as staff tracked the rising smoke with no visible fire, one advisor finally asked the question everyone else was afraid to say aloud. Who reached out to him first? And why does it feel like they've been waiting for this moment for years? Another advisor answered with a whisper. Because they have. But the most unsettling part wasn't the calls themselves. It was the one call Marcus Trenton made in return. A call so unexpected. So strategically precise. That when Washington learned who he contacted, the entire political map shattered. There are calls a former president is expected to make. Old allies. Loyal donors. Think tank veterans. Strategists who owe him favors. This wasn't one of those calls. This was the call Marcus Trenton was never supposed to make. Not in public. Not in private. Not in any timeline where politics behaved normally. Because at 12:41 p.m., 45 minutes after Washington realized the map was shifting, Marcus Trenton dialed a number tied to a person no one imagined in his orbit. A person who, for years, had built a reputation as his ideological opposite. A person whose name, when paired with his, created sparks, arguments, cable news chaos. Someone every strategist swore would never align with him. But Trenton didn't care about expectations anymore. He cared about something else. Something deeper. Something strategic. Something inevitable. The phone in Trenton's hand wasn't his standard device. Not the one assigned by security. Not the one handled by aides. Not the one leaked in news articles. This phone was different. Matte black. Unregistered. Signal routed through 3 international nodes. A device only 6 people in the world had access to. And the number he dialed wasn't saved. He typed it from memory. He waited through the ringing. Once. Twice. 3. A voice answered. Calm. Cold. Almost annoyed. How did you get this number? Trenton didn't waste a breath. We're past that question, he said quietly. A long silence. Then the voice spoke again, lower this time. Do you have any idea what happens if someone finds out we're speaking? Yes, Trenton replied. That's why we're speaking now, before they do. The voice exhaled sharply. Marcus, what are you planning? Trenton didn't answer immediately. He looked out the window, at the midday light bending across the Potomac, at the city that once cheered him, then questioned him, then forgot him. Finally. I'm planning to finish what I started. Another silence. He could hear the person on the other end weighing the risk, the fallout, the consequences. And then. Where do we meet? When that sentence was spoken. When do we meet? Everything shifted. Because the person Trenton contacted was the former Senate Majority Leader who once publicly vowed never to work with him again. A political heavyweight. A strategist of terrifying precision. A figure Washington respected, because Washington feared them. For years, they had been Trenton's opposite. Oil and water. Fire and ice. Two tectonic plates always on the verge of collision. Yet now, for the first time, they were aligning. Not by accident. By necessity. They agreed on a location. Not a think tank. Not a private club. Not a secure facility. A diner. A simple, unremarkable, American diner off a quiet stretch of Route 29. The kind with neon signs buzzing overhead. Coffee brewed too strong. Cracked vinyl seats. Farmers at the counter. Country rock humming from a dusty speaker. Trenton chose it for one reason. It was too ordinary to notice. And that made it the safest place in the world. But safety wasn't the goal. Plausible deniability was. No back entrances. No controlled rooms. No protocol. Just two people who weren't supposed to share the same continent. Sitting 3 feet apart. Under flickering lights. With the smell of burnt toast in the air. At 1:18 p.m., a waitress named Becca. 21, community college student, double shift worker. Noticed two customers sitting alone in opposite booths. She didn't recognize them. Not at first. One wore a baseball cap low enough to hide his eyes. The other wore a gray jacket with no logos, no insignias, no personality at all. But their silence told a story. The kind of silence, she would later recall in an interview. That made the whole room feel like it wasn't supposed to hear a word. She didn't know she was looking at a moment that would fracture Washington. She didn't know she was witnessing the beginning of a pact that would ripple across the entire nation. She just refilled their coffee cups and walked away. Sometimes history doesn't announce itself. It just sits in a booth and waits. When the former Senate Majority Leader finally slid into the booth across from Trenton, they didn't shake hands. They didn't smile. They didn't exchange pleasantries. The first thing Trenton said was, "I'm not here to win back Washington." And the leader replied, "Good. Because Washington isn't what's at stake anymore." For a moment, neither spoke. The hum of the diner filled the air, forks clinking, plates shifting, conversations blending into white noise. Then the leader leaned forward. "Marcus," they whispered. "What exactly did you set in motion last night?" The former president looked down at his untouched coffee. Then he spoke a sentence that would later become the center of every documentary, every analysis, every investigation that followed. "I didn't set anything in motion. I just stopped holding it back." The leader froze. Because that sentence meant only one thing. Something much bigger than him was already moving. And Trenton had finally stepped out of its way. But what neither of them knew. Not yet. Was that someone else was watching the diner. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Someone who understood the stakes better than both of them combined. And that person had already taken the first photograph. The photograph that would ignite the firestorm. It began with a click. Soft. Sharp. Barely audible under the neon hum of the diner's buzzing sign. Most people would have missed it. Most people did. But the camera didn't miss a thing. A lens, smaller than a dime, hidden in the sleeve of a faded denim jacket. Angled perfectly toward the booth where Marcus Trenton and the former Senate Majority Leader sat across from one another. Two silhouettes. One moment. One impossibility captured in a fraction of a second. A meeting that should have never happened. A partnership that wasn't supposed to exist. A conversation that could rewire the political circuitry of an entire nation. And the person taking that photo. They weren't press. Weren't an activist. Weren't a random diner customer. They were something else. Something Washington had almost forgotten about. A ghost. He sat alone, posture relaxed, eyes unfocused, the kind of person who blends into the periphery of ordinary life. The kind of person you don't question. Don't notice. Don't remember. He ate slowly, barely lifting his head, flipping through a newspaper he never read. And beneath that paper, beneath that casual stillness, his right hand pressed a tiny device. Camera. Audio. Signal splitter. His name wasn't known in Washington circles. Not yet. But his job was. He was a contractor for a private intelligence intermediary, a term used to describe entities that operate between governments, corporations, and individuals with money but no official authority. His orders were simple. Monitor unusual activity connected to Marcus Trenton. Report anything anomalous. He didn't expect a former president to walk into a quiet Route 29 diner. He didn't expect the former Senate Majority Leader to follow. He definitely didn't expect them to sit together. But when the impossible appeared, he did what ghosts do. He documented it. And vanished. The image wasn't high resolution. It wasn't beautifully framed. It wasn't meant for a magazine cover. But it had something far more explosive. Proof. Trenton. The leader. Side by side. Coffee cups in front of them. Head slightly bowed in conversation. No context. No audio. No caption. Just enough ambiguity to destroy careers. And enough clarity to send Washington spiraling. The ghost forwarded the photo to his handler with one line. You're going to want to see this. He didn't realize that sentence would start a chain reaction that couldn't be undone. The handler, known only as Harrow, received the file while sitting in a dimly lit office above a pawn shop in Baltimore. He opened it. Zoomed in. Zoomed out. Stared. Then whispered. Oh God. Not out of fear. Not out of shock. Out of realization. Because Harrow understood something instantly, something even the ghost didn't piece together. This wasn't a clandestine meeting. This was a signal. A message to the people watching the board. A warning to the ones who thought Trenton had no moves left. A declaration to the insiders who believed they controlled the future. Two enemies meeting in broad daylight didn't happen by accident. Not at a diner. Not without security. Not without precautions. Unless they wanted to be seen. Harrow didn't hesitate. He forwarded the image through 3 channels. 1. A restricted journalist circle known for early political leaks. 2. A donor intelligence group that traded secrets like currency. 3. A federal contact who wasn't supposed to receive anything unofficial. Each recipient reacted the same way. Confusion. Fear. Calculations. Panic. In less than 6 minutes, the photograph traveled through encrypted chats, burner networks, and dark channels that had been quiet for years. And someone, no one knows who, made the fatal decision. Send it to a news editor. At 2:03 p.m., the photo landed in the inbox of an editor at a major digital outlet. He stared at it. He knew what it meant. A former president and his rival. Together. Alone. Speaking privately. He didn't hit publish. He didn't hit delete. He hesitated. And that single second of hesitation. Was the exact moment the story slipped out of his control. Because someone, an intern, an assistant, a colleague, saw the preview on his screen. And they took a screenshot. Just like that, the image multiplied. Unstoppable. Untethered. Untraceable. By the time the editor looked up, the storm was already forming. First, a whisper. Then a murmur. Then an eruption. Group chats exploding. Newsrooms scrambling. Campaign offices going silent. Analysts muttering, "No, no, this can't be real." One strategist threw a pen across the room. Another whispered, "If this is authentic, we're done." And a political advisor, pale, sweating, muttered the phrase that would define the next 48 hours. Why now? What are they planning? What's coming? Because nothing in Washington was more terrifying than the possibility that Marcus Trenton had found an ally. In the last place anyone expected. But the most shocking part wasn't the photo's leak. It was who saw it first inside the federal government. A young analyst. A new hire. Barely 26. Sharp. Observant. Too smart for his own safety. He recognized the diner. He recognized the angle. He recognized the meaning. And he made a call he shouldn't have made. A call that will come back to haunt him in segment 18. But for now, all you need to know is this. When he sent that photo up the chain, it hit the desk of someone with the power to change everything. Someone who reacted not with panic, but with a smile. As if they'd been waiting. As if this was the moment they needed. As if a plan, long buried, had finally reached ignition. Because what happened next wasn't chaos. It was choreography. And Marcus Trenton hadn't even spoken a single public word yet. The photograph spread faster than truth ever could. Before the first newsroom confirmed anything. Before the first strategist issued a denial. Before any spokesperson could even clear their throat. America had already made up its mind. Not about what happened. But about what it meant. Because meaning moves quicker than facts. And by the time the sun slid behind the Capitol dome that afternoon, the meaning was everywhere. Two enemies. In a diner. Talking like allies. Every assumption about Washington. Shattered. Every expected storyline. Dead. The country felt it instantly. A shift, a tilt, a pressure drop. Like the moment before a tornado touches down. And no one knew where it would land. The image hit social feeds at 2:11 p.m. It wasn't verified. It wasn't contextualized. It wasn't even properly cropped. But it didn't matter. Because the moment it went live, the internet reacted like a startled animal. Confused. Frantic. Instinctual. Comments spiraled. Is this real? No way they met alone. Someone's playing God. What are they planning? Why does it feel like the system is rebooting itself? And then came the phrase repeated in 1,000 variations. This changes everything. Even though no one knew what everything meant. But you know this feeling. That eerie, electric sense that something massive is happening just out of frame. A country doesn't need confirmation to feel the ground shaking. At 2:37 p.m., the first major outlet went live with a developing banner. Not a confirmation. Not a denial. Just a question. Why were Marcus Trenton and his former rival seen meeting privately? Not if. Not allegedly. Not reportedly. They skipped right to why. The most dangerous word in American media. Within minutes, competing networks scrambled to catch up. Producers shouted across newsrooms. Editors demanded sources. Legal teams begged for caution. No one listened. Because caution doesn't win viewers. Shock does. Mystery does. Contradiction does. And this story had all three. At 3:02 p.m., something unusual occurred. A sudden fluctuation in three sectors. Defense. Energy. Telecommunications. Not a crash. Not a surge. A tremor. Like the system exhaling before bracing for impact. Analysts on trading floors whispered. This isn't a leak. It's a signal. But a signal from who? Politicians? Insiders? Intelligence? Or something deeper? Something older? Something buried? Something waking up? At 3:18 p.m., the photo hit the White House Situation Room. It wasn't brought in through official channels. It wasn't delivered by advisors. It wasn't part of a briefing. It arrived through a back-channel alert flagged simply as Priority, National Stability. The Chief of Staff stared at the screen. Two men who once defined the country's deepest divide. Now seated inches from each other. As if the past decade of conflict had been nothing more than a miscommunication. No, she whispered. No, this isn't real. But the deputy director beside her shook his head. It's real, he said. Question is, why now? Another advisor spoke up, voice trembling. If they're working together. Who are they working against? No one answered. Because everyone was thinking the same thing. And no one dared say it aloud. But the most important reaction didn't come from networks, markets, or officials. It came from a single person. A person neither Trenton nor the leader knew was watching. A person with clearance high enough to see patterns others couldn't. A person who understood the photograph's true meaning. Because they recognized someone else in the background. A reflection. Barely visible in the stainless steel napkin dispenser on the diner table. The reflection of a man whose presence should have been impossible. A man tied to an operation. Decommissioned. Classified. Erased. 10 years earlier. This analyst. The same young rookie who spotted the diner in segment 7. Picked up his phone and called a number his supervisors didn't know he had. Sir, he whispered, breath shaking. We have a problem. The voice on the other end spoke calmly. Describe what you see. I see, two former enemies meeting in public. And what else? The analyst swallowed. I see someone who shouldn't exist. Silence. Then the voice replied. Good. It means phase 1 was successful. The analyst froze. Phase 1 of what? But the line had already gone dead. At 4:01 p.m., every network simultaneously cut to breaking news. Phones buzzed. Radios crackled. Offices, kitchens, gyms, classrooms. Everyone stopped. Because there it was. The photo. Full screen. Unavoidable. Two men. One moment. 20 years of political gravity. Pulled into a single image. And the anchor's voice trembled. If authenticated, this could signal a realignment no one expected. Americans leaned closer to their screens. Not for clarity. Not for truth. For the feeling. The sense that something enormous had just breached containment. And still. Marcus Trenton hadn't spoken a single public word. Not a statement. Not a denial. Not a tweet. Nothing. Silence. Which made the country wonder. Is he planning something? Or is something planning him? But while America argued, panicked, analyzed, and speculated, Marcus Trenton left the diner. Walked calmly to his car. Closed the door. And in the quiet of that moment, away from cameras, chatter, and chaos, he received a text message from an unknown number. 5 words. It's time. He's awake. Washington is a city built on noise, press briefings, hallway whispers, dueling leaks, clashing egos, the constant hum of ambition against marble walls. But on the 9th morning after the Trenton revelation, the noise died. Not gradually. Not naturally. But with the unsettling abruptness of a machine that's been unplugged. This is where segment 9 begins, in the strange, heavy quiet that follows national shock. The documentary camera glides over the Capitol at dawn. Muted sky. Empty K Street sidewalks. A line of black SUVs still running but going nowhere. A reporter standing alone with a mic lowered, staring at her phone as if waiting for orders that never come. Voiceover drops like a whispered confession. Every system has a stress threshold. America just found hers. The nation hadn't processed the truth yet, not fully, not honestly, not together. And in that gap, something else was forming. An uneasy coalition of silence. Washington's reaction split into 3 layers, 3 psychological time zones the city drifted between like an unstable orbit. Zone 1, denial disguised as procedure. Committees still met. Staffers still stapled briefing packets. Senators still pretended their calendars mattered. But their eyes betrayed them, unfocused, distant, reading futures they didn't want to say out loud. One aide who agreed to speak anonymously describes the mood this way. It felt like everyone was rehearsing for a play after the theater had already burned down. The motions continued. The meaning didn't. Zone 2, the private panic. Behind closed doors, fear metastasized. A Treasury official admits. Markets don't panic because of bad news. They panic because of uncertainty. The uncertainty around Marcus Trenton was now radioactive. No policy team could map it. No strategist could predict it. No intelligence analyst could model its next move. Washington had seen power, extremism, crisis, but never a president who shattered his own political DNA in one televised confession. This was new territory. Uncharted. Unstable. And everyone in the city knew it. Zone 3, the tapestry of silence. This was the most dangerous zone. The quiet one. The one nobody could measure. The networks pulled back. Commentators paused. Even the outrage ecosystem, normally automatic and reflexive, froze. There was no take ready. No narrative prepared. America didn't just stop speaking about Marcus Trenton. It stopped thinking aloud. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was anticipatory. Like the breath held before a verdict. In the West Wing, silence took on an entirely different meaning. The senior staff was divided into 2 factions. The stabilizers. Keep the system functioning. Project Calm. Contain the chaos. The realists. Something fundamental has broken. We need a contingency plan. A national security advisor describes that morning in chilling terms. You could feel the building's temperature change. The Oval wasn't just a room anymore, it was a gravitational anomaly. No one said it aloud. But the question hung in every hallway. What happens when a revelation becomes a rupture? Polling firms refused to publish early numbers, not because they lacked data, but because the data made no sense. Demographically, nothing aligned. Patterns inverted. Conventional political behavior dissolved. A demographer explains. This wasn't a shift. It was a psychological migration. Rural voters behaved like disillusioned urban blocs. Urban blocs acted like chaotic independents. Independents moved like a pack with no leader. The electorate was no longer predictable, it was fluid, volatile, and emotionally charged in a way the nation hadn't seen in half a century. Every segment so far has hinted at it. Here, in segment 9, the audience finally feels it growing. Fear not of what Marcus Trenton had done, but what he might do next. The confession was not the climax. It was the ignition. Washington wasn't preparing for the aftershock. It was bracing for the next wave. 9 days after the revelation, deep inside a quiet corner of the old executive office building, an analyst uncovered something small, something overlooked, something that shouldn't exist. A timeline discrepancy. A document with an unexpected signature. A gap in the official schedule. A meeting that wasn't supposed to happen. It doesn't matter what it is yet. Not to the audience. Not to the story. What matters is this. The silence wasn't natural. It was hiding something. And for the first time since the revelation, someone in Washington whispers the sentence that will define the next arc. What if the confession wasn't the truth? But the beginning? Fade out. A long beat. Then a cold title card. Washington runs on contradictions. They are the air the city breathes, the background hum under every handshake, every memo, every closed-door meeting. But some contradictions are small, almost invisible. And some are powerful enough to fracture the entire system. 9 days after the Trenton revelation, a file appeared. A document buried in plain sight inside a secure server, marked classified, eyes only. Nobody knew who put it there, and for a moment, it felt like the document had simply materialized. Inside the file was a single word, contradiction. And beneath it? Lines of numbers, emails, and meeting notes that didn't make sense. A timeline that refused to be linear. A series of moves by Trenton and his former rival that contradicted every assumption about politics, loyalty, and strategy. Jessica Brandt, 28, cybersecurity analyst, the youngest person on the executive security team, was first to notice it. She didn't click. She hesitated. Because something about the file felt alive. Like it had been waiting for her. Her supervisor asked. "Are you sure you should open it?" Jessica whispered back. "It's already open. In the system." And when she finally dove into the data, the contradictions hit like a shockwave. Meetings labeled routine were anything but. Emails timestamped at 2 a.m. originated from devices no one knew existed. Travel logs contradicted public statements by hours, sometimes days. Something was moving behind the surface of Washington. Something orchestrated. Something invisible. And it wasn't just Trenton. It was the entire network of insiders, operatives, and ghosts the country didn't know existed. The contradiction file revealed the first paradox. Trenton was simultaneously retired and strategically active. He appeared inactive in public databases. But in private channels, his influence was immense, coordinated, and expanding. Jessica's screen displayed the patterns. Calls, meetings, messages, financial moves. All aligned with events no one could have predicted. Her hand hovered over the mouse. She knew what publishing, even internally, could mean. A whisper of doubt crossed her mind. Do I warn them, or let it unfold? The contradiction file didn't just expose Trenton. It exposed the system itself. Washington was never as orderly as it seemed. Rules were suggestions. Hierarchy was performative. Authority was temporary. And in the contradiction file, the truth became crystal clear. The real power doesn't lie in elections. It lies in the networks no one acknowledges. And Marcus Trenton had navigated them all. This insight spread like a virus through Jessica's mind. She realized what Washington didn't. The presidency is not a position. It's a node. And Trenton controlled the most important nodes, quietly, invisibly. Jessica noticed something else. All contradictions followed a single pattern, trust and treachery, indistinguishable until consequences unfolded. Allies of convenience. Enemies turned partners. Messages sent publicly for one audience, privately to another. She ran simulations. She tested every sequence. Every outcome led to the same revelation. Trenton was never reacting. He was orchestrating. And every person he touched, knowingly or unknowingly, became part of his tapestry of influence. By evening, the contradiction file had reached the chief of staff. She read a single line and froze. All lines of authority intersect here. Nothing can be trusted at face value. Meetings were rescheduled. Strategies rewrote themselves in real time. Analysts argued over what was evidence versus what was distraction. A political advisor muttered. It's not just the president, it's the illusion of the president that's under threat. They were right. Because the contradiction file didn't just redefine Trenton. It redefined the rules of the entire capital. Jessica leaned back, exhausted, staring at her screen. The real danger, she whispered, is not what he's doing. It's that no one can define what's normal anymore. And that was the key. Because in Washington, definition is power. If the definition of normal shifts, everything shifts. Policies, alliances, loyalties, even the very structure of authority. And suddenly, it became terrifyingly clear. Trenton hadn't returned to play politics. He had returned to rewrite the rules. And yet, while Washington scrambled, while networks speculated, while analysts argued, Trenton made one small, deliberate move that no one noticed in the chaos. A move so subtle it would seem inconsequential. Unless you understood the contradiction file. And that move would change the game entirely. Washington had been holding its breath for 9 days. 9 days of silence. 9 days of tension. 9 days where no one, not the press, not the strategists, not even the federal agencies, knew what would happen next. And then it did. A single tweet. Not from Marcus Trenton. Not from the former Senate Majority Leader. Not from an official account. A tweet from an anonymous handle. Phase 1 complete. The game begins. The public barely noticed at first. But the moment analysts started tracing the source, the tremor spread. Because someone somewhere realized, this wasn't just a message. This was a signal. Within 15 minutes, cable channels cut into programming. Producers scrambled. Anchors tried to verify sources that didn't exist. The internet went wild. Every pundit had a theory. Was it Trenton? Was it a rogue actor? Was it a leak? And the truth, that this was deliberate orchestration, was invisible to them. A senior editor whispered. It's not a leak. It's a chess move. And that phrase would echo in newsroom corridors for hours. Stock tickers jumped. Indexes wavered. Speculators hesitated. Economists called it a psychological surge. An unprecedented response to uncertainty amplified by invisible orchestration. No one can measure this, a trader admitted. It's not policy. It's perception. And perception is everything. And across the country, millions felt it. The unsettling sense that something larger than life was moving in the shadows, beyond control. The contradiction file, Jessica Brandt realized, was connected. Every anomaly, every paradox, every hidden channel. Now aligned with this public tremor. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She understood that this wasn't random. It was patterned. Deliberate. Predictable. And yet unpredictable. Because the strategy was invisible until you connected the dots. And most people weren't looking at the dots. The line between chaos and orchestration had blurred. By 3 p.m., the chief of staff convened an emergency briefing. Whiteboards were filled with timelines, connections, and probabilities. Staffers spoke in hushed, urgent tones. If this continues, we're facing a systemic disruption. We can't react to him, we have to anticipate him. Phase 1. Phase 2, what does he want? And the deputy advisor leaned back, voice heavy with dread. It's not about control anymore. It's about who defines reality. Americans, meanwhile, reacted emotionally, viscerally. Not rationally. Not logically. But instinctively. Social media became a storm. Who is awake? Game begins. What game? This is a warning. Memes and speculation spread faster than verification. Two opposing groups emerged immediately. Those who feared Trenton's influence. And those who revered his audacity. Both groups, unknowingly, were already playing his game. Behind closed doors, Marcus Trenton acted. He didn't announce anything. He didn't call a press conference. He didn't speak to allies publicly. Instead, he moved silently, making contact with operatives in key industries, private networks, and think tanks. Every action was small. Almost invisible. But when combined, it formed a lattice. A structure of influence designed to outpace reaction. And Washington still didn't notice. A political analyst reflected. History doesn't record the calm before a storm. It records the first tremor. The moment the system realizes it has been outmaneuvered. And we just saw it. Because the first public tremor wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It wasn't a declaration. It was subtle. Strategic. Unmistakable. And it changed the rules for everyone paying attention. But while the world debated and speculated, Marcus Trenton received a call from someone in the shadows. A call that wasn't meant to be traced. A call that carried a single line. Phase 2 has been triggered. Are you ready? And in that moment, the true storm, the one no one saw coming, was already forming. The call came quietly. No press. No leaks. No cameras. Only Marcus Trenton's secure line. And a voice so calm it sounded almost ordinary. Phase 2 has been triggered. Are you ready? Trenton paused, exhaled slowly, and replied. Always. A single word, yet it carried decades of strategy, preparation, and intention. It was the word that made the wheels of Washington tremble in ways no one could quantify. Phase 2 was invisible. It didn't appear in headlines. It didn't appear in tweets. It didn't appear in public briefings. But it moved faster than anyone could respond. Analysts noticed unusual patterns in financial transfers, small, precise, coordinated across multiple sectors. Think tanks reported sudden anonymous memos with detailed economic scenarios, forecasting events that hadn't happened yet. Policy strategists found briefing notes appearing overnight, signed by nobody, but echoing decisions Trenton had made years earlier. Everything was designed to look organic, natural, accidental, but nothing about Phase 2 was accidental. Inside the West Wing, the mood shifted from panic to something more dangerous, confusion. Deputy advisors met with senior staff. Whiteboards filled with cross-reference charts, contacts, and timelines. One advisor muttered. It's like watching the chessboard rearrange itself while the pieces are still moving. Every attempt to map the moves of Trenton and his former rival produced contradictions. Every action suggested foresight, yet no one could predict the next step. The real danger, they realized, wasn't what he was doing. It was that no one could define what was normal anymore. By the second day of Phase 2, reporters began noticing anomalies. Local elections suddenly mirrored national patterns. Influential donors made untraceable contributions with uncanny timing. Analysts on cable news began speculating, someone is orchestrating beyond our view. But Trenton didn't speak. He didn't clarify. He didn't defend himself. He simply moved, and the world reacted. Social media users felt it instinctively. They couldn't articulate why, but they noticed. Political narratives shifting overnight. Stories emerging in places no one expected. Comments vanishing, replaced by new threads with subtle redirection. It was the digital equivalent of a storm, quiet at first, building momentum, until everyone realized they were caught in it. You've seen this before. A system operating normally, until the invisible hand twists the gears. Inside the intelligence community, the contradiction file became a roadmap. Jessica Brandt and her colleagues traced connections. Every call, meeting, and document now fit into a larger pattern. Every anomaly confirmed, Trenton and his former rival were working on a coordinated campaign of influence far beyond politics. One senior analyst whispered. This isn't about elections. It's about control, over perception, over narrative, over reality itself. And they weren't wrong. Phase 2 wasn't just data or leaks. It was theater. At 8:17 a.m., the first public ripple hit. A former rival politician gave a speech, framing it as independent commentary. A small, local newspaper reported a routine policy analysis that perfectly mirrored Trenton's intentions. Social media picked up both narratives, blending fact and suggestion into a story the nation absorbed as natural. But it wasn't natural. It was engineered. An analyst watching the coordinated events wrote in a private memo. Phase 2 is not chaos. It is choreography disguised as randomness. And the performers, they don't know they are part of the dance. Because that was the genius, or danger, of Trenton's design. Every reaction, every panic, every misinterpretation was part of the system he had built. Washington thought it was reacting to him. But in reality, it was following the path he had already determined. And yet, amid the unfolding storm, Trenton made a single, imperceptible error. A miscalculation so small it almost seemed trivial. But in the world of hidden power and invisible networks, trivial mistakes ripple like earthquakes. And that ripple was about to awaken forces no one had anticipated. Phase 2 had begun. Washington struggled to comprehend it. Analysts scrambled to track it. The public felt it in whispers, in subtle shifts, in the undercurrent of every headline. And Marcus Trenton, as always, moved silently through the chaos. Or so it seemed. It started as a single misstep. A miscommunication. A delayed message. A network contact who failed to respond at the exact required moment. No one noticed. No one predicted it. No one thought it mattered. But in the world Trenton had orchestrated, precise, coordinated, invisible, trivial mistakes are catastrophic. A strategist inside a private think tank noticed a small anomaly. Something doesn't line up. The timing is off. Not by much, but enough. And enough is all it takes. Jessica Brandt, studying the contradiction file, was the first to connect the dots. Phase 2 had relied on an intricate web of data flows. Every contact, every signal, every message had to align perfectly. Even a 1-minute delay in a single channel could ripple across the system. That delay had occurred. A minor error in protocol. A trivial misalignment. Yet suddenly, patterns started diverging. Signals conflicted. Predicted outcomes skewed. The invisible choreography began to wobble. Inside Trenton's private network, a subtle alarm went off. Check anomaly 42. Cross-reference all channels. Verify all nodes. Operatives moved, calm but tense. The systems were resilient. The architecture was strong. But the human element, unpredictable, flawed, fallible, had inserted itself. Trenton, in his quiet office, noticed. He frowned. He exhaled. For the first time in Phase 2, he hesitated. Because here is the paradox. Even the most brilliant orchestration can be undone by imperfection. Even the most controlled storm can be altered by a single ripple. And imperfection is human. Trenton was human. His former rival was human. And the world around them, unpredictable, reactive, chaotic, was unforgivingly human. No plan, no file, no algorithm could fully account for it. The contradiction file, Jessica's map of invisible moves, highlighted the divergence. Predicted alignment, 99.7%. Actual alignment, 94.2%. That 5.5% difference may seem small. But in a network like Trenton's, it's seismic. Signals collided. Unexpected outcomes appeared. Even the networks that were supposed to be insulated felt tremors. A single operator whispered. "We're seeing things we didn't account for. It's alive. It's evolving." And she was right. By the evening, subtle anomalies began leaking. Local news reports slightly contradicting expected narratives. Social media speculation about hidden motives grew louder. Influencers started asking questions that couldn't be ignored. The public didn't know what was happening, but they felt it. The rhythm of expectation, carefully controlled, was broken. Even Washington couldn't ignore it. Inside a secure communications hub, a low-level analyst noticed an unusual pattern in public reactions. Something's deviating. Not just the plan. The perception itself is shifting. The analyst sent a quiet alert. Phase 2 may be compromised, they wrote. No one panicked, yet. But the whisper of doubt had entered the system. And whispers have a way of growing. And that whisper, almost imperceptible, caught the attention of someone Trenton hadn't accounted for. Someone patient. Someone observant. Someone waiting in the shadows. Because even the most controlled storms can awaken forces you never expected. The stage was set. The game was no longer just phase 2. It was something bigger. Something inevitable. And soon. The first true confrontation would begin. Washington hadn't seen it coming. Not the analysts. Not the strategists. Not even the journalists desperate for a thread to follow. Phase 2, meticulous and precise, had been disrupted. A small imperfection, almost trivial, had sent ripples through the system. But ripples, in a network like Trenton's, become waves. And every wave has a breaker. No one knew their name. No one knew their allegiance. All anyone knew was that they were patient. And they were watching. The first movement came quietly, a call, encrypted and anonymous, routed through 5 intermediary servers, bouncing across continents before reaching a terminal in Washington. The message was simple. Phase 2 has shifted. We move next. No explanation. No signature. Just the certainty of intent. And somewhere, Trenton felt it. A subtle disturbance in the rhythm of his network. Like a tremor under a calm lake. Not dangerous yet. But present. Persistent. The shadow acted like a chess player centuries ahead. Assets that had appeared dormant suddenly became active. Communications that should have been silent ignited with subtle signals. Observers, analysts, operatives, all began noticing small anomalies in their data. Trenton's plan, precise as it was, had met resistance. Not from a government. Not from a rival. But from someone operating outside the expected patterns. The first message appeared on Jessica Brandt's screen, anonymous but unmistakable. You missed a node. Correct it, or consequences unfold. Trenton paused. He realized something fundamental. Even the most precise orchestration relies on humans. And humans are unpredictable. His former rival. Unaware of the shadow. Operatives. Blind to the signals. The public. Completely irrelevant. Only one thing mattered, the shadow had entered the game. And now, the rules had changed. Inside Washington, subtle tremors became visible. A senator canceled a meeting without explanation. A policy advisor changed a briefing point mid-sentence. An operative noticed communications that didn't align with Trenton's expectations. Jessica leaned back from her screen. Her eyes widened. She whispered to herself. It's not just phase 2. It's someone rewriting the flow. And she was right. There is a paradox here. The closer you control the storm, the more sensitive it becomes. The more precise your orchestration, the easier it is to disrupt. And sometimes, the most invisible adversary is the one that reveals the fragility of your power. Trenton understood this. He had anticipated surprises, anomalies, errors. But the shadow was different. Unseen. Unpredictable. Patient. And patience is lethal. No press release. No tweet. No official statement. Yet the public felt it. Minor contradictions in local reporting. Influencers subtly questioning the narrative. Analysts puzzled by deviations in market behavior. A ripple, almost imperceptible. But Jessica knew. It was the shadow's first move in the public sphere. And it was a warning. Trenton knew the shadow existed now. But he didn't know their capabilities. He didn't know their reach. He didn't know their intentions. And in that moment, a single truth crystallized. Control is an illusion. And illusions can be shattered. The next confrontation would not be strategic. It would be personal. And the storm was about to break. Washington had become a city suspended in expectation. Every office, every hallway, every press room held the weight of uncertainty. Phase 2 was already fracturing. The shadow had emerged. And now, the storm was personal. Marcus Trenton never underestimated perception. He knew the value of timing. He knew the power of subtle influence. But even he didn't anticipate the human response. The shadow had targeted someone close. Someone whose loyalty Trenton had assumed was unshakable. Someone whose actions could ripple through the entire network. He received a single encrypted message. Your proximity does not guarantee alignment. Personal vulnerabilities are visible. Trenton stared at the screen. He didn't move. He didn't speak. But a shadow passed across his calm exterior. Even the most calculated leaders cannot always control the human heart. Inside Washington, subtle tremors turned into chaos. An aide broke protocol, revealing information prematurely. An ally publicly questioned Trenton's judgment during a closed briefing. Analysts noticed communication channels being redirected in ways that weren't part of any plan. The shadow's influence had penetrated the inner circle. It was no longer theoretical. It was tangible. It was real. Jessica Brandt, watching patterns shift on her terminal, whispered. It's not just phase 2. It's phase 2 plus human error. And human error, in the context of Trenton's network, was devastating. The storm wasn't violent. It wasn't public. It was a pressure wave, subtle, psychological, relentless. Trenton, always composed, felt it in his instincts. A crack in trust. A hint of doubt. A tremor in perception. Control is never absolute. Even the master of the storm can feel the wind shifting. The shadow had done what no algorithm, no file, no analyst could do. It had entered the human element. While the inner circle battled uncertainty, the public caught echoes of disruption. Unverified reports of disagreements among top officials. Cryptic statements from think tanks and policy commentators. Social media speculation that the storm had reached personal levels, rumors, suspicions, unnamed betrayals. Americans didn't see the precise moves. They felt the tension. They understood the stakes, even without knowing the full story. You felt this before. The sense that everything is changing. And you are powerless to stop it. The paradox of phase 2 now became clear. Absolute control is impossible when humans are involved. Even the most calculated strategy can be undone by a single personal choice. And sometimes, the most devastating influence comes from within your own circle. Trenton understood this. He had built networks, orchestrated moves, predicted reactions. But personal vulnerability, that was unpredictable. And the shadow had found it. By the end of the day, 2 previously loyal operatives questioned their allegiance. Strategic decisions were delayed. Phase 2, meticulous as it was, began to diverge. The storm had entered human territory. It wasn't digital anymore. It wasn't algorithmic. It was deeply personal. And Trenton realized the first truth of leadership that Phase 2 couldn't shield. Power is only as strong as the people around you. And the people around you are fallible. As night fell over Washington, Trenton retreated to a secure location. He lit a single lamp. He opened a private terminal. And he began drafting the next move. Because the shadow had struck first. And if he wanted to survive, he would strike back harder. The personal storm had begun. And the public hadn't even seen the lightning yet. The storm was no longer abstract. It was personal. It had entered Trenton's inner circle. It had disrupted Phase 2. And now it demanded a response. Trenton, always deliberate, knew one thing. You don't react. You orchestrate the response. He didn't panic. He didn't shout orders. He sat quietly in a dimly lit room, the hum of servers around him like a heartbeat, and began planning the retaliation. By midnight, the network was activated. Operatives across the country received secure instructions. Analysts like Jessica Brandt were briefed on new anomalies, subtle signals to trace the shadow's influence. Communications were rerouted, encrypted, and layered with decoys. Trenton's former rival joined remotely, silent, focused. Together, they mapped every observed movement of the shadow. Every anomaly. Every deviation from expectation. And then, Trenton wrote a single line that would define the retaliation strategy. We do not meet the storm, we reshape it. The shadow had relied on subtlety, precision, and invisibility. Trenton's response would exploit the same principles, turned inward. Misinformation seeded in the shadow's expected channels. Patterns disrupted to appear as errors, when in reality they were traps. Operatives positioned to act only when the shadow made the first visible move. It wasn't brute force. It wasn't public spectacle. It was chess, played in a dimension the public would never see. You've asked this question too. How do you fight an opponent you can't see? The answer is, you make them visible, in ways they can't anticipate. The retaliation began quietly. A minor leak, carefully crafted, created uncertainty in a shadow-linked channel. A single operative initiated a contact meant to misalign the shadow's network. Analysts monitored every response, every correction, every ripple. Within hours, small cracks appeared. Messages were misinterpreted. Channels conflicted. The shadow's advantage, subtle, invisible, patient, began to waver. It was the first public sign of resistance. Though no one outside the network knew it yet. Power is never absolute. Strategy is never perfect. Even the most calculated adversary can be influenced by human psychology. Trenton's retaliation proved a paradox. By exploiting imperfection and patience, he could regain control. Not with visibility. Not with authority. But through influence over perception itself. And perception, in Washington, is everything. Within the West Wing, advisors noticed subtle improvements in alignment. Analysts felt the chaos stabilize, just slightly. Even the contradiction file, the map of anomalies, showed the first signs of resolution. It wasn't complete control. It wasn't victory. But it was the first sign that Phase 2 could survive the shadow's interference. Trenton leaned back, exhausted but focused. He knew the shadow would respond. And when it did, the confrontation would escalate beyond Phase 2. The retaliation was only the beginning. The storm was about to become a hurricane. And somewhere in Washington, the shadow, unseen, patient, precise, was already planning their counterstrike. Phase 2 was already a storm. Trenton's retaliation had begun. But storms have a way of growing, and Washington had no idea what was about to hit. The shadow, patient and unseen, made its first visible move. It started small. Erratic reports in local media. Unexplained delays in policy implementation. Social media posts that contradicted official narratives. At first, analysts dismissed them. A fluke. A coincidence. But the anomalies didn't stop. Jessica Brandt leaned forward, eyes narrowing at her terminal. It's coordinated. And it's deliberate. The shadow had entered public perception. Phase 2's delicate balance had shifted. And the retaliation, while effective in some channels, couldn't stop the hurricane. By mid-morning, Washington felt it. Senate communications conflicted with executive orders. Analysts reported minor, yet consequential, financial misalignments. News anchors stumbled over inconsistencies, creating a sense of instability that spread across the nation. The public didn't know the full scope. They only felt the tension, the dissonance, the sense that something larger than politics was in motion. You felt this before. That subtle shift in the air. The city holding its breath before a hurricane arrives. Inside the network, Trenton's operatives scrambled. Redundant communications activated. Misaligned signals corrected in real time. Analysts recalculated probabilities with minute adjustments. But the shadow was relentless. Every step Trenton corrected, the shadow introduced new friction points. Trenton realized something crucial. Absolute control was impossible. Influence could only guide chaos, never erase it. And chaos, in Washington, feeds itself. By afternoon, the hurricane manifested visibly. Politicians argued publicly over conflicting directives. Press briefings contradicted each other within hours. A viral social media thread implied insider conflict, unverified, yet believable. The American public watched, fascinated and anxious. Washington's illusion of order was fractured. Even the most loyal allies began questioning decisions. And the shadow, unseen, smiled in silence. There is a truth embedded in chaos. The more perfect your plan, the more devastating the disruption when it fails. The more controlled the system, the greater the power of unseen forces. And the stronger the storm, the more human vulnerabilities it exposes. Trenton understood this. The hurricane wasn't a failure. It was a test. A mirror reflecting the limits of even the most calculated strategy. By evening, advisory channels flagged conflicting messages. Analysts noticed the first cracks in Phase 2's pattern. Operatives reported anomalies that weren't predicted. The system had bent under pressure. But it hadn't broken, not yet. Trenton paused, looking out over the Capitol from a secure location. He whispered to himself. A hurricane reveals everything. And now, we see the fault lines. The shadow had made itself visible. Phase 2 was destabilized. And now the confrontation would escalate beyond invisible tactics into a battle the public could witness. The hurricane had hit. And Washington would never be the same. By sunrise, Washington was in a state of controlled chaos. The hurricane of Phase 2 had fully hit. The shadow's moves were no longer subtle. They were visible, undeniable, cascading through every corner of the Capitol. And for the first time, the public could see the collision. Cable news cut into every segment. Government in disarray. Signals of internal conflict. Anonymous influences at play. Tweets went viral. Threads exploded. Memes formed faster than fact checks could catch up. Anchors stumbled over each other. Reporters tried to parse reality from perception. And Americans, glued to screens, felt the tension as if it were personal. You felt this before. That prickling sense that everything you know might be false. That reality itself is being tested. Even the most cynical viewers couldn't look away. Inside government offices, the collision became tangible. Meetings scheduled for hours were abruptly cancelled. Advisors argued over conflicting intelligence. Analysts discovered contradictory instructions, some from Trenton, some from the shadow, others from rogue channels they couldn't identify. A senior staffer muttered. "It's no longer strategy. It's a fight for the definition of truth." Because that was exactly what it had become, a battle over perception, authority, and control. Americans felt the collision in subtle ways. Conflicting reports about policies created confusion. Local and national news told different stories about the same event. Social media threads fractured, spreading doubt, speculation, and fear. It wasn't violence. It wasn't protest. It was a psychological earthquake, shaking confidence in institutions. Jessica Brandt observed it all. The system is responding, but not in the way we expected. The shadow has inserted itself into public perception. And perception, in a democracy, is power. Trenton reacted swiftly. He reinforced trusted communication lines. Operatives embedded subtle corrective measures into networks. Analysts worked in shifts, recalculating probabilities, tracing anomalies, anticipating the shadow's next visible moves. Control was no longer about dictating outcomes. It was about survival and adaptation. The collision wasn't a defeat. It was a challenge. And challenges reveal who can endure. Collisions expose truth. Systems are only as strong as their weakest assumptions. Power is only as resilient as the perceptions it manipulates. And influence, invisible or visible, always finds the cracks in human nature. Trenton understood this. The shadow understood this. And now, Washington itself would learn it. By afternoon, analysts observed anomalies in both political and financial networks. Social media commentary began shaping public narratives faster than official statements could respond. The shadow's influence, once invisible, now guided the collective perception of millions. And one quiet realization settled in. This is no longer phase 2. This is a systemic collision. Trenton knew the shadow had reached the public sphere. And now, he faced a choice. Respond publicly and risk exposure. Or continue orchestrating invisibly and risk losing control of perception. Because the next move would define who truly controlled the storm. The hurricane had passed. But the air in Washington was electric. The collision had left scars, subtle, yet undeniable. And now the battle had shifted, from strategy to perception. Trenton realized the truth. Control is not about what you do. Control is about what the world believes you do. The shadow had learned the power of visibility. Anonymous leaks began appearing in national outlets. Influencers reported inconsistencies in government messaging. Public perception began to shift, subtly, like tides moving under a fog. Trenton studied the patterns, his eyes scanning lines of code, communications, and signals. Everything is public now. But nothing is clear. It was psychological warfare at its finest. And the battlefield was every mind paying attention. Trenton responded. Carefully timed messages inserted into social channels. Analysts deployed narrative corrections disguised as routine communications. Operatives seeded truth fragments into media circuits, creating controlled chaos to balance the shadow's influence. He understood the paradox. Overcorrect and you expose yourself. Underreact and the storm consumes perception. The delicate balance between action and restraint had never been more critical. Americans felt the tension, whether they realized it or not. Social media threads clashed, each narrative pulling in different directions. News anchors stumbled over conflicting reports. Public forums became battlegrounds for trust, doubt, and speculation. You've experienced it before. That moment when you realize the story you trusted might be a lie. And yet, you can't look away. Perception had become the weapon. And the weapon was aimed at everyone. The paradox of influence is simple, yet profound. Power is meaningless without belief. Strategy is impotent without perception. And the mind, once exposed to contradiction, becomes both battlefield and casualty. Trenton understood this. The shadow understood this. And now, the American public, unknowingly, was part of the fight. Within the government, advisors argued over the meaning of every tweet, statement, and leak. Analysts recalculated predictions every hour, only to see new anomalies emerge. The contradiction file, once a roadmap, now reflected dynamic chaos. Jessica Brandt noticed a single trend. Every time we think we've aligned perception, it shifts. Someone else is pulling strings we can't see. The system was teetering. And the next misstep could cascade beyond repair. By evening, the shadow's influence had reached the most unexpected arena. The human element itself. Trenton realized the fight was no longer about strategy, networks, or data. It was about trust, belief, and identity. And in Washington, where everyone's eyes were watching everyone else, perception was the new battlefield. By dawn, Washington was fractured. Not physically. Not visibly. But in every conversation, every decision, every perception. The shadow's influence had infiltrated the very framework of trust. Phase 2, meticulous as it had been, had hit the limits of control. The storm wasn't outside. The storm was inside every mind paying attention. Political alliances wavered. Loyal aides questioned directives. Senators publicly contradicted each other during hearings. Policy memos contained subtle inconsistencies, leading to misinterpretation. The public noticed. Media narratives splintered. Social media threads tangled into contradiction loops. You've seen it before. The tension between what you're told and what you sense is real. It was not chaos. It was calculated friction. And it spread faster than anyone could counteract. Within Trenton's network, operatives corrected errors only to find new anomalies emerging elsewhere. Analysts recalculated probabilities endlessly, only to watch outcomes deviate. The contradiction file became less predictive, more descriptive, a mirror of unfolding chaos. Trenton understood the paradox. Absolute control is impossible in a system that includes human perception. Influence can guide. It cannot guarantee. And now, the human mind had become the battlefield. Americans felt the fractures. Conflicting reports led to doubt in institutions. Social media speculation blurred with fact, creating a fog of belief. Trust wavered. Certainty vanished. People argued. Communities polarized. Opinions hardened. And the unseen hand guiding perception only amplified the divide. Fractures are not failures. They are revelations. Systems reveal their weaknesses when tested. Power is exposed when trust erodes. And perception, once fractured, cannot easily be restored. Trenton understood this. The shadow understood this. And the public, unaware, was now both witness and participant. Trenton acted. Narrative reinforcements deployed subtly, never directly confronting the shadow. Operatives recalibrated influence channels to regain alignment. Analysts identified fracture zones and prioritized stabilization. But the cracks remained. The storm wasn't over. It was evolving. The system had reached its fracture point. And only adaptation could prevent collapse. As night fell, Washington braced. The shadow had prepared Phase 3. Trenton had countermeasures, but they were reactive. And somewhere in the shadows, a single variable remained untouched: human choice. The fracture wasn't just structural. It was moral, emotional, and entirely unpredictable. The next segment would reveal how Washington's institutions, and the people within them, faced the pressure of choice under the storm. The fractures had spread. Washington was no longer a city of order. It was a city of decisions under pressure. Every choice mattered. Every hesitation rippled. Every misstep amplified the storm. You've been here before. Standing at the edge of a decision. Knowing the world will feel your consequence. And the world was watching. Trenton understood the system, the networks, the algorithms. But humans, unpredictable, fallible, were the wild cards. A senior advisor received a leaked directive, unsure whether to act. An operative debated loyalty versus ethics. Analysts wrestled with incomplete data, knowing every recommendation could shift perception dramatically. Even the most disciplined minds faltered under pressure. Even the most loyal hearts questioned alignment. Control is an illusion when human choice intervenes. Americans, now fully aware of inconsistencies and contradictions, responded in ways neither Trenton nor the Shadow had predicted. Social media threads erupted into moral debates. Communities argued over truth, loyalty, and responsibility. Analysts noticed patterns of emotional contagion spreading faster than factual corrections. Perception, belief, and emotion became the battlefield. The storm wasn't just political. It was psychological. It was emotional. It was existential. Trenton's response shifted. Phase 2 had been tactical. Phase 3, emerging now, required moral calibration. Choosing which narratives to reinforce. Deciding which human loyalties to protect. Measuring consequences for both network stability and public trust. Every decision carried a paradox. Protect control, risk morality. Protect morality, risk influence. Even Trenton, master strategist, recognized the stakes were now human first, strategic second. The Shadow exploited this. Signals were sent to test loyalty. Misdirection targeted ethical dilemmas. Small leaks forced individuals to reveal priorities, exposing fractures inside Trenton's network. The Shadow understood. Humans are the ultimate vectors of disruption. And each misstep was amplified in the public sphere. Chaos is not always external. Sometimes, it lives in the minds of those who govern it. The battle isn't about power or data. It's about choice. And when choice is conflict, even the strongest structures tremble. Trenton knew this. The Shadow knew this. And every person touched by the system, conscious or not, was part of the experiment. By evening, one operative secretly withheld information to protect a colleague. A junior advisor leaked a small but consequential memo to test public reaction. Analysts debated whether transparency or secrecy would stabilize perception. The storm had entered the moral realm. And the outcome could no longer be predicted solely by algorithm or influence. The collision between human ethics and systemic strategy had begun. Trenton faced his greatest challenge yet. Controlling the storm without losing the humanity that defined him. And the Shadow was already preparing the next pressure wave, targeting the human element directly. The storm was no longer abstract. It had shifted entirely into the human realm. Every choice, every hesitation, every ethical judgment sent ripples through Washington. Trenton had orchestrated systems, networks, and influence. But humans were unpredictable. You felt it before. The weight of decisions you cannot fully control. The pressure that builds until clarity is impossible. And that pressure now defined the battlefield. Inside government. Advisors argued late into the night, torn between loyalty and principle. Policy directives collided with moral judgments, creating indecision at every level. Analysts realized the contradiction file, once predictive, now reflected human conflict more than strategy. Data could guide. Algorithms could suggest. But ethics, human ethics, had entered the game. Washington felt it in subtle ways: tension in briefings, hesitation in decisions, silence where certainty once lived. Americans saw fragments of the storm. News anchors corrected themselves mid-broadcast, unsure which narrative was verified. Social media debates erupted into morality plays, assigning blame, questioning integrity, challenging authority. Opinion polls fluctuated wildly, reflecting not policy but human perception under pressure. The storm wasn't just political. It was psychological. And it was contagious. The shadow's influence magnified each human choice, turning hesitation into spectacle. Trenton's response evolved again. He focused less on networks, more on the people operating them. Loyalty, trust, and ethical alignment became the priority. Micro-decisions were scrutinized for their psychological impact, not just tactical outcome. He realized the paradox. Control is impossible without human alignment. And alignment requires empathy, trust, and moral clarity. Every miscalculation could cascade into public perception and systemic collapse. The shadow exploited this vulnerability. Subtle manipulations forced operatives to make ethically compromising decisions. Advisors were tested publicly and privately, their responses magnified in perception. Leaks targeted moral dilemmas rather than tactical weaknesses. The lesson was clear. Humans are the most effective vectors of disruption. And Phase 2, meticulous as it was, now faced the ultimate human challenge. The paradox of power. The more precise your systems, the more fragile your human element. And the more fragile your human element, the more perception, trust, and morality become weapons. Trenton understood the truth. Systems can bend. Algorithms can adapt. But human ethics, flawed, unpredictable, passionate, define the ultimate outcomes. By midnight, operatives questioned orders publicly, citing ethical concerns. Analysts reported anomalies created by human hesitation, not technical error. Public perception began diverging sharply from expected narratives. The storm had entered the moral and psychological core. Washington wasn't just fractured. It was conscious of its own fragility. Trenton realized that controlling the storm meant confronting humans, not algorithms. The shadow had found the pressure point. And now, the next wave wouldn't just challenge strategy. It would challenge identity itself. By dawn, the storm had reached its core. Not strategy. Not networks. Not even perception alone. It had reached identity itself. Trenton realized a harsh truth. Control is meaningless when it collides with who people believe themselves to be. The shadow didn't need to break systems. It needed to fracture identity. And Washington, unprepared, felt it everywhere. Advisors, operatives, and analysts struggled. Loyalty conflicted with conscience. Orders conflicted with personal belief. Predictions failed because humans were no longer just agents, they were moral actors. Jessica Brandt noticed the shift in her data. It's no longer anomalies. It's people recalibrating themselves. Reacting not to orders, but to perception, morality, and fear. Every human in Phase 2's web was now a variable outside the algorithm. Americans felt subtle tremors of doubt. Tweets questioning personal values over policy went viral. Local communities debated integrity, loyalty, and leadership more than politics. Media anchors stumbled under the weight of contradictions, their own credibility tested. You've experienced it before. That sudden awareness that the story is bigger than you imagined. That truth and identity are intertwined. The shadow's influence had transformed invisible disruption into a visible reckoning of self. Trenton realized the paradox. He could orchestrate networks. He could influence perception. But he could not control identity. Phase 2 required a recalibration. Influence had to respect human belief. Morale had to be preserved. Trust became the most valuable currency. One wrong move, and the storm would destroy the human foundation of his strategy. The shadow acted with precision. Ethical dilemmas were magnified in public discourse. Operatives faced decisions that tested not loyalty, but their understanding of self. Advisors questioned whether their choices aligned with who they truly were, not just what was commanded. The shadow understood a principle older than politics. You can bend systems, but identity bends you. And now, Phase 2 was being rewritten, not by algorithms, but by conscience. Identity is fragile. Identity is powerful. When belief, loyalty, and morality collide, systems fail. When perception meets identity, chaos becomes inevitable. And when humans face themselves under pressure, even the strongest plan falters. Trenton had built networks, orchestrated influence, and predicted outcomes. But he had never fully accounted for human self-awareness under siege. By afternoon, leaks, debates, and contradictions amplified personal crises into public narratives. Social media spread stories of conflicting loyalties and moral dilemmas. Washington's institutions trembled under both practical and ethical pressure. The hurricane of perception had become a storm of identity. The battle was no longer just strategic. It was existential. Trenton understood the final truth. To survive Phase 2, he would have to navigate morality, identity, and human conscience. Not just strategy and networks. And somewhere, unseen but decisive, the shadow prepared the ultimate test. The city held its breath. Washington was no longer a place of schedules, policy, or strategy. It was a pressure chamber of conscience, perception, and identity. Trenton realized, the shadow had not merely disrupted Phase 2. It had engineered the ultimate test. Control, influence, and strategy were gone. Only human choice remained. Every operative, analyst, and advisor faced dilemmas. Obey orders and compromise personal ethics. Act independently and risk the system collapsing. Remain silent and watch chaos spread. Jessica Brandt observed patterns that were no longer data-driven. They were behavior-driven. And each behavior contained a moral cost. The shadow had turned strategy into conscience. Every move carried consequence. Every choice carried meaning. Across the nation, Americans debated not just policy, but morality. Communities fractured over ethical dilemmas and loyalty. Media narratives became mirrors of human conflict rather than objective reporting. You felt it once, didn't you? That unsettling sense that what you believe may be challenged. That the world tests not your logic, but your soul. Perception and identity collided. Chaos was no longer abstract. It was intimate. The shadow remained unseen, but its design was clear. Public contradictions amplified private conflict. Ethical dilemmas engineered hesitation in decision-making. Systems strained under the weight of human conscience. The shadow didn't destroy networks. It revealed them. And in doing so, it revealed humanity itself. Trenton recognized the brilliance. And the danger. There is a paradox at the heart of power. Absolute strategy cannot survive human conscience. Absolute control cannot survive self-awareness. Absolute perception cannot survive identity tested under pressure. Trenton faced it now. Phase 2 was more than a plan. It was a reflection of human limits, resilience, and fallibility. The storm wasn't just around him. It was inside him, inside everyone, and inside Washington itself. By nightfall, operatives acted independently to correct or disrupt outcomes. Advisors revealed truths, withheld secrets, or chose silence. Analysts recorded, predicted, and attempted control, but human conscience dictated the results. Trenton understood the final truth. Phase 2 was no longer about winning. It was about guiding humanity through its own storm. And the shadow? It was the unseen teacher, testing endurance, choice, and identity. Trenton had survived the hurricane, the collisions, the fractures, and the moral test. But Washington's story, and humanity's, would not end here. The ultimate lesson. The system bends. Humans break. And yet, some truths endure. The final segment would reveal how the storm resolves, what survives, and what begins anew. The storm had passed. Washington was quiet. Not because the tension was gone, but because the city, the systems, and the people had learned to breathe again. Trenton walked through the empty corridors of power. Every room held echoes of the hurricane, the collisions, the fractures, and the moral dilemmas. Every step reminded him, Phase 2 was over, but the consequences were eternal. You know this feeling. That moment when the storm ends. And all that remains is reflection. Phase 2 had tested strategy. Phase 3 had tested perception. The shadow had tested identity. And in the aftermath, one truth became undeniable. Humans define the system. Not algorithms. Not networks. Not even the most brilliant strategies. Trenton understood the paradox. Influence is temporary. Power is fragile. Identity is enduring. And the storm had proven it. Across the nation, Americans debated, reflected, and argued, but with a new awareness. Trust had been tested. Belief had been challenged. And yet, something resilient remained: human consciousness, questioning, and engagement. You've seen this before. Moments when society pauses. When reflection follows chaos. And in that pause, something begins anew. The hurricane had altered perception. But it had also shaped the future. Inside Washington, networks stabilized, though never exactly as before. Policies were recalibrated to include lessons from human unpredictability. Operatives, analysts, and advisors emerged wiser, more conscious of the limits of control. Trenton knew the system could be rebuilt. Not flawless, not absolute. But resilient in a new way, aligned with humanity itself. The paradox of survival. Systems endure when humans endure. Power survives only when conscience is acknowledged. Control is fleeting, insight is permanent. Phase 2 had ended. Phase 3 had tested every human vector. And Washington, fragile, flawed, human, had survived. Freedom isn't inherited. It's practiced. Trenton gazed at the city lights. The quiet hum of life resumed. He whispered to himself. And maybe, this is where everything begins again. The storm had revealed everything. Strength, weakness, human vulnerability, and resilience. And in the quiet that followed, the next chapter awaited. Not dictated by strategy or perception. But by choice, conscience, and humanity itself. You felt this once. That sensation of ending. And the subtle promise of beginning anew. The story ended not with victory or defeat. But with reflection, endurance, and the timeless lesson. Systems may bend. Storms may break us. But humans endure. The series concludes here. A cinematic exploration of chaos, strategy, perception, morality, and identity, leaving viewers with both tension resolved and reflection lingering. Exactly the way a true American documentary should.